Today, we are going to talk to Anik Waldow about empathy and the book she co-edited, Philosophical Perspectives on Empathy.
So thank you very much, Anik, for accepting my invitation.
My pleasure.
Sorry. Thank you very much for accepting my invitation and for the time and effort. So as usual, I have an introductory note about you, and then I'll go to the questions. Anik Waldow is a professor in the philosophy department at University of Sydney. She mainly works in early modern philosophy and has published articles on the moral and cognitive functions of sympathy, theories of personal identity, the role of affect in the formation of the self, and skepticism. Among her publications are Contemporary Perspectives on Early Modern Philosophy, Nature and Norms in Thought, 2013, Sensibility in the Early Modern Era, From Living Machines to Affective Morality, 2017, and David Hume and the Problem of Other Minds, 2021. So, Anik, my first question is basically, what is empathy and what brought you to empathy?
Okay, the first question is basically, I cannot answer it because empathy is a terribly difficult term and has many, many different meanings in their different contexts. So maybe I'll start with the other question, and then as we go through the conversation, it might become clear what empathy is and how it contrasts with similar concepts such as sympathy, pity, compassion, and so on and so forth. But just perhaps as a rough work definition, it might be useful to just think of empathy as something that enables me to feel what you're feeling. I can perhaps also understand what you're feeling. I can perhaps also share your beliefs. So they can already see how difficult it is to pinpoint exactly what empathy is. But I think just to have something to work with to start with, actually, it's useful to think of it as some sort of mechanism that connects me with the mental states of other people. And how this is working is a huge question. Okay, so and why am I interested in this question? Well, I started, I think I was always interested in the problem of rationality and irrationality, and especially in the intersubjective context. So my question was always, how can I understand another person, basically? You can take that to be somehow related to the problem of other minds, which I've worked on earlier in my career. But the problem of other minds is usually cast in terms of knowing the other, having knowledge of what the other person, or that the other person has a mind, and then also knowledge of what the other person is experiencing, thinking, so on and so forth. But that's not quite what I mean when I say I'm interested in how we can understand others. It's more about how to make sense of others, and it's more related to the question of rationality and irrationality. How can I understand what another person is saying? How can I understand what another person is doing? And when I worked on these topics, I came across theories of, because I worked in the historical context, theories of sympathy, which I'll explain in a moment how we can sort of map those concepts onto one another. So basically, I came across theories that thought that the connection between other minds is not just a matter of just some cognitive, it's not due to a cognitive process where I just kind of hear what you're saying and then I understand what you're saying, and thereby I get an understanding of what you're thinking or feeling. I came across theories where this process was cast in terms of affect, the transmission of emotions between people. And I thought that this is really interesting in terms of understanding how we sometimes struggle to think of someone as making rational choices, or struggle just to understand where another person's coming from or what the other person is saying or thinking.
Right. But I mean, usually I'm not specialized in empathy or sympathy, but just like usually to my mind it's like more associated with with feeling and affect. I mean, the concept of empathy, and that's why it seems that to a large extent it has been marginalized in the history of philosophy. I mean, the history of rationality and philosophy. Is it so? I mean, to what extent do you think empathy has been marginalized in history of philosophy?
Yeah, that's a big question, and probably that will take us also to the distinction between sympathy and empathy, and sort of developing a better understanding of how we came to think of empathy the way we do today. So, well, in the history of philosophy, when you look at those overview chapters of empathy and where it's coming from, often people take it back to 18th century, to the philosopher David Hume. And I've been working a lot on David Hume, and when I said I was interested in the problem of other minds, that's really where I started. But David Hume doesn't talk about empathy. Empathy is a concept that emerged in the 19th century. He talks about sympathy. Sympathy is similar to what I just described in the first, when I answered your first question. Hume thinks of it as a mechanism that connects people with one another. It describes how the emotions and beliefs of one person can travel and be recognized by another person. So that's sympathy. So similar to what many people today would think of as empathy. So empathy is the capacity to understand the emotions and beliefs of other people, and perhaps even feel them, or have an understanding of emotions and beliefs of other people by or through feeling them. So David Hume was one of the first people who really had kind of a theory about that. And when you say marginalized, I take it maybe it's the idea that, and the more general idea that an engagement with emotions was basically in philosophical theorizing that was done in a particular way, and it had to do with a particular conception of what human beings are. So when, historically speaking, human beings were often characterized as those with a rational animal. So when you want to say something about humans and how they're special, and analyze what thought is and what the mind is, what people have, then directly people are concerned with the more rational aspect of our existence as humans, and sympathy, and especially the idea that emotions are factored into our understanding of one another and understanding of the world in general. That was not very popular for a long time. I mean, there are a lot of hybrid theories, and people were grappling with that question. So it's not that people were not interested in this question at all, far from it. It's more that emotions were seen in a particular light. And when I say that, so sympathy, that describes how we come to feel certain, or sympathy is often also seen as describing a certain type of emotion, that was kind of seen in a certain light, and often seen as contrasting with our more rational understanding of the world. So kind of trying to take you to the point where then people moved on first from just thinking of emotions as kind of these lowly things that should not really interfere with our more rational understanding and process of cognition in general, to appreciating empathy as having important functions. So the one step that really mattered there was, when you trace it through the concept through the history, was you can see that the original context within which sympathy was discussed was moral. So David Hume had a theory of how our ability to connect with the feelings of others informs our moral judgments. That was kind of the strand that was further developed by other philosophers like Smith. And then something happened around the beginning, beginning of the 1900s. That happened kind of when English authors were read by German authors. So Johann Gottfried Herder was reading the British authors, and he also had a theory of, he called it Einfühlung, and he described very similar phenomena that Hume described as sympathy. But he called it Einfühlung, which is more or less feeling yourself into. But he wrote in German, so that was, and he broadened the concept. So he took it from the moral context, and also had a theory about how engaging with art, with literature, Einfühlung, feeling ourselves into something really matters. But he also thought about it in terms of morality. So how is our feeling with someone actually motivating us to care for this person and to act in certain ways and to judge in certain ways about what is good and what is not good. And then once it was in the German context, then you have this kind of tradition which kind of is associated with Wiesner and Theodor Lips, and then also Titchener, who then retranslated Lips into English. And they also had their different ways of thinking about Einfühlung, because they wrote in German. Also covered the aesthetic dimension of it, the moral dimension, also the more psychological dimension, that we're kind of interested in the question of how can we understand one another, what is happening there. And then with Titchener, who translated Lips, then we have the emergence of the concept of empathy. So Einfühlung became empathy via the German language context. And then when you say it was marginalized, it's true that in the last kind of 10 years, maybe a bit longer, people turned to empathy and were really, I don't know if they rediscovered it, but maybe a lot of people wrote about it, and sort of there the impression can emerge that it was marginalized. But I think it was always part of the history. It was perhaps not noticed by us that much, because if you look at how philosophy, or the mainstream philosophy of second half 20th century, sort of the focus was perhaps somewhere else. But I think in recent years that has changed, and there were a lot of publications in the last few years, and a bit longer now, let's say 10 to 15 years, that were dealing with empathy and emotions more generally.
Can we apply this difference that's usually made between cognitive empathy and affective empathy, and also what you described in English and German tradition?
I don't think you can map the distinction cognitive affective empathy onto particular context. I think there are elements of both in theories, in different, like in the German context and the English, Scottish context. But what's at stake here when you distinguish between affective and cognitive empathy is the idea that you can understand someone else via beliefs. So you can form a belief about what another person is feeling or thinking. Or you can do that via feeling or experiencing something. So you can basically understand where the other person is right now in her kind of state of mind by actually tuning in with her feelings. And then you feel, or the idea is that you feel either something identical or similar to what the person's feeling, therefore you understand the other. So it's more kind of an experiential basis that informs your understanding of the other. And in recent years, people have tried to kind of explore this idea of having this direct experiential kind of basis of an understanding of another person via what came to be known as simulation theory. Simulation theory is a famous example is you look at for instance, a rock climber, and the rock climber struggles to hold on to his position up in the air, high above the ground, and immediately you feel, you're nervous and you feel like falling yourself, although you're on the ground. So, and then the idea here is to say, okay, this is something, there are no mediating thoughts here, no mediating belief, it's direct. You see the situation, it affects you in a certain way, you feel in a certain way, and through having these experiences and emotions, you know what's going on with this person. it's complicated, because just feeling fear doesn't mean that the rock climber also feels fear, right? So there you already have the problems that come up when you talk about empathy as something enabling you to have an understanding of the other. Is it really an understanding, or is it just a projection of your own feelings? And is it just a projection of how you would feel in that situation? So that's the problem. And then opposed to that, kind of, for a long time, people have argued that no, there's an alternative account. It's called theory. So it stresses, this theory stresses that it's not via direct experience, not via affective impetus that you understand another person, but it's rather through having beliefs about what the other person is having as an experience or feeling. And then you might also feel something related to having that belief. And over the years, people have moved away from these dividing up the landscape categorically into those two camps. And now a lot of people say, look, there are many processes that intersect and overlay one another. So we cannot just say it's either this or that. So it's not either just cognitive or affective. It's probably rather combination. And many factors have to be taken into account here. For instance, how much do I resemble the other? And some people argue, well, if there is sufficient resemblance between me and the other, with resemblance not stretching, not just encompassing the sort of, you know, some people talk about species resemblance and so on and so forth. So a very broad concept of resemblance. But what's here meant is more similar experiences, similar experiential history, coming from a similar social background. So if those kind of resemblances are in place, it's more likely that your simulation of the other person's feeling will actually really yield something that is similar to what the other person is really feeling. But of course, when you come from very different backgrounds, I mean, what are the chances that you can really feel like the other person's feeling, unless you really assume that all human beings are just the same, independent, and that would assume that history and what we're going through in our lives, our education, social influences, don't really matter on how we respond emotionally to certain situations. I don't think this is very plausible.
Yeah, it's very interesting for me, Anik. I mean, I have this perhaps like basic and even naive question, I mean, or irrelevant, that is like, can empathy be inserted in my knowledge of the world, in the sense that, for example, I feel committed to support other races or other minorities, for example. So I've read the history of them. I know their history of slavery, of racism or sexism. Can then I like insert empathy in my knowledge of the world and in my engagement with those people in my social and political life?
Yeah, there is literature on that in relation to moral education. So you can say, okay, what are the options to teach children, for instance, to have a sense of what is right or wrong, right? And then you can go different ways. And one strategy seems to be to encourage children to be empathetic. So encouraging them, that means they're not automatically empathetic. So a lot of theorists I know would say, no, human beings are naturally empathetic. And this seems to be also a case among animals, interestingly. But the idea with moral education is that you enhance, perhaps, or amplify an already given natural capacity through a certain training, right? And what could that training involve? So, for instance, in some of the articles that I read, it's that teachers and parents and carers then just encourage the child to swap perspective, right? What would you feel in that situation? What would you think if you were, suffering from A, B, C, D? So basically it's guidance in terms of connecting the child with the situation the other person is in via perspective taking. So another way, and I think maybe a less hands-on way, but more something that perhaps we all do to varying degrees, is we confront ourselves with, for instance, films, novels, with characters, that are in very peculiar circumstances. We also read about history, and when you talked about, for instance, people living in very different conditions, suffering from a lot due to the circumstances. And of course, you can sort of encourage your imagination to really connect with those people via empathy by reading, hearing, absorbing information, so they can already see that this crude distinction between affective and cognitive doesn't really work, because when you read about the background story of someone in a refugee camp, for instance, and the life of that person, this is a cognitive process, right? You read, you imagine, you put together the information in a certain way, you evaluate it, but that also goes hand in hand with having certain emotions in response to it, provided there is such a thing as an empathetic, a natural empathetic capacity or a receptivity to the suffering of others. That's how people earlier in the 18th century called it. So I think a lot of people think there is such a natural capacity, but of course you always have to take into account that some people feel less, they're just not as receptive, not as susceptible. And then the type of education or training might come in as an opportunity to increase that or sort of make people more empathetic, but it might not work. So it really depends. And
for me, it causes another question, probably on the other extreme of empathy or sympathy, which is like, I mean, being empathetic or sympathetic probably does not always guarantee a moral act. For example, you can be empathetic to a dictator. I mean, you can support through sympathy, you can support a kind of authoritarian regime, or yeah. So there are probably some dark aspects of sympathy and empathy also.
That's right. So to bring that question out, it's good to focus on the two philosophers. So Adam Smith, who is also a friend of David Hume's, thought that when we have sympathy, so sympathy here was defined as the matching of two people's emotions, same degree, same type of emotion, then this is something that basically cannot sort of immediately pushes you towards the right thing, right? You think the right thing. So there is nothing that can go wrong there, really. Whereas Hume said, no, it's not like that. It can go wrong. So sympathy is neutral. So let's say I can connect with the feelings of a person who's extremely violent, and then by connecting and imagining myself to be in that situation, that sparks some desire for violence in me. So it could be, right? Or think of scenarios like where people are chasing people in the street, and there's a mob and there's just one person, and then people join in, and there is a frenzy, going on, and it spreads. So this comes under the heading of contagion. So emotions can spread, and of course those can be violent emotions, but they can also be good emotions. Like, for instance, when you go into a room, like a party, and everyone is very happy, and then immediately you feel happy yourself just by being surrounded by happy people. But it can go in both directions. That's the point. And I think, Hume had a point there, that it's hard to say just because we are empathetic, we cannot harm other people. I don't think that's right. Adam Smith doesn't say it in that crude fashion, so I don't want to attack him here, but I think it's very important to really remember that there can be these dark sides of empathy, because it has a lot to do with just imitation. And when you imitate, you can imitate just everything, right? And then the problem is really, or the question that needs to be asked is, with whom are you empathizing? What is your social field here? And what are the values that structure the social interactions within that field? So, and that can be, it comes out, I mean, if you construe the case just of someone who fits into a particular group and everyone has the same values, then the question arises, okay, how can you ever become critical of those values if you just reinforce them by surrounding yourself with people who feel the same, and then you empathize with one another, share those thoughts and feelings, share them around and pass them around, and then how can you ever develop an external perspective on what's going on there? But then from the point of view of some minorities, for instance, who are surrounded by people who have very different values and also oppress those minorities, empathy can be very threatening, right? Because you can think of yourself either as not deserving more respect, not deserving more attention by those people who form the majority party, or it can just show you how condescending people are towards you, and that can hurt, right? So there are these dark sides. And then yet in other cases, when sympathy or empathy breaks down, when there's no understanding of the other. So for instance, I'm confronted in one of the talks I gave recently, someone said, yes, I was recently confronted with a flat earther, and I simply couldn't understand where this person was coming from. And then sympathy in terms of understanding the thoughts and reasons of another person, this just breaks down. So what are we supposed to do in this situation then? Are we then just supposed to leave things and just say you are different from me? I can't understand where you're coming from. Or what is a constructive way of dealing with this kind of situation?
So, I mean, like, to talking about violence, what I conclude from your idea, I mean, your the way you paraphrase it, is that empathy by itself does not guarantee reducing violence, for example.
No, it doesn't. I mean, because it really depends on who the people are you're sympathizing.
Right. Yeah, there was another point which was is always interesting for me. Especially when you talked about training empathy in children, or like the pedagogical size of empathy. I was wondering if reading literature, for example, can boost, can develop empathy. But
here again, you have to be careful what you read, right?
What you read,
it's the same story as with choose your friends well, and choose your books well. So, and also choose the books well that you give to children, for instance. That's why it's so important, because I mean, I might refer to a debate that was also in the 18th century around the Enlightenment, and when the idea was that we progress towards a brighter future, right? And then we just have to train our reason appropriately. But it wasn't just all about reason. There was also something about moral emotions. And one way of training your emotions and your reason to interact with your emotions in the right kind of way was to go to the theater. And so the idea was to empathize with the characters on stage, to feel their emotions in a kind of in a quasi sense that it's not your life, it's not your situation. You are not threatened directly. You just kind of try it on like a dress. So what would it be like to be in that situation? And that was seen as something important in terms of moral education, that you learn through perspective taking, through seeing the different points of view of the characters on stage, what life is like, and then also how you can get out of certain situations, and what the morally correct decision is, and what the morally appreciated action would be. So, and I think this debate on the Enlightenment theatre is really interesting, and you can sort of think of it as applying to many, many things today. For instance, films, when you go to the cinema, what you read, the media, what type of newspapers you read, what type of opinions and convictions you take on and surround yourself with. And then always, I think it's important to bear in mind what is the critical potential here. So how can you develop a perspective where you can reflect on certain perspectives? So it can't be just that you just, as I said, try on perspective like dresses and then you put them to the side. Some sort of critical engagement and reflection on those different points of view has to be there. Otherwise, we are just like ping pong balls and we're just thrown around by the circumstances of life.
Anik, I have a very personal, I mean, there is an experience like almost 8 years ago. There was this presidential election in Iran. And so I don't remember if it was my aunt or uncle. I mean, some of them were like supporting one of these hardliner candidates. And then once I asked him on that, I mean, why are you going to vote for him? I mean, he's brutal. He's not like democratic and so on. His answer to me was, he's old, you know, he has a nice voice, you know, he's ill, you know. And so, I mean, it's interesting for me to what extent empathy can be different from culture to culture, even. I mean, even in terms of the values, you know, what you recommend constantly, which is interesting for me, is that be cautious on what you choose, which books you're reading, which friends
Absolutely.
you're hanging out with, and in the absence of this value, you have a large exposure to some feeling of just being connected with something without any criterion.
Yeah, it's both, right? Because your example is quite good because it's your uncle. So you're connected by family ties. So there's already this, also the situational setting is such that you connect with this person. I mean, everyone knows this, right? Intergenerational conflicts and the political views diverge, sometimes quite dramatically. So how to deal with that? So on the one hand, you empathize in the sense, okay, you're old, I understand you desire this from your point of view, that might make sense, right? But then again, so does that just mean that I have to take over your perspective and just condone and accept, okay, it's fine, you know? And I think there it's, you cannot have a blanket answer there. And that's also why I think you cannot just attribute too much to empathy, that it has to be seen as doing a certain role within a more complex theory of how decisions are made, of how evaluations are carried out. So how we engage with background information, situational settings, but also with our own values. And that always takes us to the role of reflection. How do we reflect on ourselves in relation to the other person? What do we stand for, we ourselves? And it's one thing to be tolerant and to accept that the other person might have a very, very different point of view. But then the question, I don't really have an answer to it, is when does it break down, right? When is the conversation over? Is it when, for instance, example of my own past, some people, when I was younger, when I was a teenager, I mean, either you leave the room or you can try to have a discussion, or you have different options, but what do you do with that, right? So I think there are various things that can happen where you could just think, okay, this is it, that's as far as it goes to try to build a bridge. But then on the other hand, of course, what we see today over and over again is what happens when the connection breaks down entirely. When people who hate each other just surround themselves with those who hate those that you hate as much, right? So what's happening then? And is that a good way to proceed? And I believe that we still have to seek some sort of conversation. I think that's really important.
Right.
But then it has to be a conversation that is carefully orchestrated, and there are lots of problems there. So to sum up the point, I think empathy is important in order to explain how we can learn to be more tolerant and more open-minded. But of course, at the same time, one has to bear in mind that there might be limits, right, to what one can take and accept.
And again, so sort of my last question is also relevant to some experiences I have had with refugees. You know, like there was this example, I mean, you just implicitly talked about it, like empathy in the absence of communication. For example, how can I be empathetic to a refugee whose language I don't understand? Something that a lot of Germans experience in the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, empathy doesn't work necessarily through language, right? It's kind of happening when you read about something. There's language involved when you listen to a podcast about something, or language in a conversation, in a direct conversation. But if you don't have language, well, it's also the pictures, right? It's the facial expressions, it's the scenes that you see. I remember a few years back in Europe, I think it was in 2018, there was still a lot of people in wintertime on the streets, and it was really, really cold. A lot of people lived in stations in Paris with children all over the place, refugee children out in the cold, sleeping on the floor everywhere. And also in Germany, you saw that, but less so than in France, I remember. And there you don't need language, right? You just see what's happening, and you see, I don't know. I mean, again, back to our other question, are you then naturally empathetic? Do you care about seeing children sleeping in the station in the cold or not? And not just children, also their families, their fathers, their mothers.
So sorry to interrupt you, Anik. So there is something like being naturally attuned to be empathetic.
Yeah, people tend to think that, but don't forget there are also these blocking mechanisms. Just don't look at it. Or those people who vow to be against kind of engaging with this issue of refugees in a constructive way, sometimes simply dehumanize these people so that you do not empathize on the basis of not thinking of them as being part of humankind in some sense, right? So there are these mechanisms that can block something that might be naturally given to you as a disposition, but then it's just blocked out by certain reinforced beliefs, by certain strategies, by certain values you might have. So that's of course possible. So it's too easy to say that we are all empathetic.
That's a huge topic, and it was a very interesting talk, and I personally enjoyed a lot. I mean, there are points, probably my questions were somehow far from some specific questions, but I really learned a lot, and it was joyful. Thank you very much, Anik, for the talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.